Hello and welcome to the Beginner's Handbook. I'm Jordan.
I'm Jamie.
And in this episode we're going to talk about running games on the line but without virtual tabletops, or at least our experience with it, if any, and what our preferences would be. So yeah, that's pretty much what it's going to be like. So normally we do a little bit of a question for whoever's listening and or watching. So for this one, it's just dead simple. It's just, if you're playing games online, what do you prefer to use? Do you use virtual tabletops? If you do, what ones are they? Because there's a couple of big ones that tend to come up a lot, but there's also some people that prefer to just scrap it entirely and go to something like Zoom and just play a game like a Zoom call. So just wonder what yourselves that are listening elsewhere actually use.
Yeah, I mean, it would be interesting for me to see what everybody's, or in general, what people are doing, because there's the free virtual tabletops that might not necessarily give you a lot of features, but they're free and everybody can look at the exact same thing. Everybody can see what's going on. You can move tokens about, all the kind of the basic standard stuff is there and available. And then again, like you're saying, there's just doing it over Zoom and kind of relying on each other a bit more rather than the technology. So it'll be interesting to see where people are.
Yeah, so basically a virtual tabletop, or a VTT, which I think is probably going to be in the title, so in case you don't know what that is, it's basically just a tabletop that you play on your computer. So it might be a wee 2D one that you can roll dice on. You might have character sheets appearing on the table, or icons or models for your character. You can get a whole selection from things like 2D ones to 3D ones, like fully 3D. There's a whole bunch of them there, and some of the big ones would be things like Roll20 being probably one of the biggest ones, and certainly the one that we use the most, just because it's free. There's limits and stuff on it, but you see, for what we need it for, it's actually pretty simple and pretty good.
Yeah,
there's a paid one alternative called Foundry, which I've seen a lot of it, more of it, recently. And I actually really, really like it, but it's way more complex to play and use. And there's a whole slew of other tabletops, virtual tabletops out there. So one that I wouldn't have considered a virtual tabletop at the time, but I do now, especially because I've done a few games in it, would be something like Tabletop Simulator, which you can get just on your computer. And you've got a whole wealth of games on there, especially if you go into the workshop, and you can get a whole bunch of games. Like you even get things like Morkborg and Cyborg, like character sheets in the game. If you use VR, you can pop on your VR headset and you'll sit in literally a virtual tabletop in a VR headset. It's all really cool. So that's just a couple. There's honestly quite a few others, and I think D&D Beyond, I'm pretty sure theirs isn't out yet as of the time of recording anyway. I'm sure it's not out yet, but they've showed stuff for it and it looked pretty cool. So anyway, that's what virtual tabletop is. It's just a digital platform that you might use to play your role-playing games.
Yeah.
That's all.
Yeah, and funnily enough, I was going to ask you if you knew if anybody had started introducing VR or AR stuff into the tabletops, and you just answered the question.
What they do, and I actually had, back when I was doing some more game development stuff, I had one of these things where it was a director for, I can't mind, he came into our class and he was talking about it was one of these big films as well, but I can't remember what it was. It wasn't Blade Runner, but it was one of these sort of quite popular sci-fi films. Anyway, the director came and spoke to us, and from that chat I'd done a kind of virtual tabletop, switching scenes, music and stuff. And I only done it for like a concept stage. Now I'm pretty sure Tabletop Simulator was out way before I'd tried this. I'm going, wouldn't it be so cool to have a VR tabletop for your RPG games? And then cut to like a year and a half, 2 years later, I go, oh, look at this really cool game to play Mansions of Madness on. And then I'm going, wait, it's got VR as well. Pretty cool. It's totally worth giving it a go, because
I like the idea that after we finish recording this and I've left, you say, how's that guy? And you discover your idea's been stolen.
It's annoying. I can't remember who it was. But anyway, it was quite nice, and
obviously not nice enough that you remembered his name.
It was a long day, man. I think me and my pals were out the night before, so we were just tired from the night before, just listening to this guy talk. But anyway, this has gone back a few years now, so that was in the, believe it or not, the prehistoric pre-COVID days as well. So got no memory of that nonsense.
20 PC.
Yeah, yeah. So anyway, that's a virtual tabletop. Just for those who don't know, let's be honest. If you play RPGs, you probably know it, but just you never know. You might be somebody that's new to the space. So, I think then. So when I talk about not using virtual tabletops, specifically what I'm talking about is just not using any of those at all. And I mentioned Zoom earlier. Just as one of the platforms for it. I've done quite a few games over Zoom. The time that we did your game that had all the tech issues, we probably would have been better scrapping Roll20 entirely for that game because there was just issues with it at the time.
Ultimately, that's what we done, but we
used it and we were on a call though on WhatsApp because we used it for the agendas.
Yeah.
So we did a hybrid of both, but we should have just went to one. But it's hindsight, man.
Yeah, and I mean, ultimately it did work because the visuals were still there and the visuals worked.
Yeah.
But it was just the audio and
more
specifically and weirder than that, it was my audio. Everybody else's audio was fine. That all worked. It all triggered when it was supposed to trigger.
Just your audio? I don't remember that. I just can't remember.
I couldn't get audio out or audio in. And that was with 2 different computers and all sorts of stuff.
I had that a couple of weeks ago when the first game you couldn't make it recently, so I spent the first hour fixing stuff. I think, but that was a completely separate issue. Roll20 actually, even since that point, that was a couple of years ago or something, or maybe a bit more. A huge difference. So it's totally worth checking out. If I was to say use a VTT, give Roll20 a go first. It's great. But not using VTTs then, a lot of the games that I'll do outside of maybe our games, I don't use them. I mean, I don't tend to use Roll20. It's nice to have pictures sometimes. Some games favour having maps and stuff. I've ran a few games recently that I actually found quite difficult because they're very heavily reliant on maps. Strange Aeons, which we'll get to at some point. Are
you sure?
The biggest downside for it, not really, but we'll find out. The biggest downside for me when I ran that the last time, or when I ran it for others, because I'm running it for a different group as well, it's so map heavy. And Alien was sort of similar, although I've spoke about Alien plenty of times. Actually, I think that was the last one we spoke about. We spoke about Alien. And I loved that game to bits, and a couple of my other pals have just started playing it as well. With a different group. They've got somebody else running it and they're loving it too, but having the map made it really hard. And I bring that up only because running games without a VTT, especially if they're map kind of centric, can just be really difficult. It can just be hard. So the sacrifices and things that have got to be made, and that's something I wanted to talk about today, just because I've had recently quite a few games that we've not had any VTT for. And I mean, there's people I know that they don't like running online games because they find it too hard, but that's because they sit and prepare, whole various selections of stuff that maybe technically they're not as comfortable or confident using, so it ends up being a bit of a mess. Whereas if you took away VTTs, I promise they would have been so much better. Just for the sake of their own sanity, for the guys running it, it would have been so much better. So. Yeah, so I think just going into the options that are out there, we've got things like, we've mentioned Zoom, but obviously there's Google Hangouts. You've got Discord, which is one that's like my favourite one to use because there's all different tools. We've actually got a Discord. If you've not, I don't think we mentioned that at the start, but we have a Discord. It's I can't remember if it's at the Beginner's Handbook or something. I can't remember the handle, but it will be in our description. Where we've tried it ourselves just to see what's you can do with it, some of the tools you can get dice rollers in Discord, which is a big reason why I think it's one of my preferences. I'm not looking for a full VTT at most. When I'm running online games, I'm looking for just something that people can see each other, hear each other, and maybe roll some dice as a nice extra. But basically anything that you can just get people face to face on the screen. That's all the options you've got out there for running games online without VTTs. So actually, have you ever ran or played a game that hasn't involved Roll20? Because I think most just pretty much always Roll20 with us.
Anytime we've done something virtually, it has been via Roll20. Yeah. There hasn't been a time where we haven't used it, and again,
unless we're in person, and in most cases we still might use it for maps. Not all the time, but I think we've definitely done that, because usually we've got computers all around the table.
Yeah, or even if it's a game that isn't super reliant on a map and you being in a particular location and everybody having to know where you are at whatever given point, there still might be one or two computers, tablets, whatever, so that there's, I don't know, a picture for setting the scene or whatever, just to kind of help with the kind of theatre of it, if you like. So again, even in person, it's probably more like a hybrid game, if you want to kind of class it like that. And then with me, when it went wrong and we had to fire up WhatsApp and stuff like that, then again it kind of went down the hybrid route, where we were using something else for communicating, but we were using the tabletop for visuals and things. So it's always kind of kicked about somewhere along the line, apart from our PC games, pre-COVID stuff, where we were always meeting in person, so we never had a need to seek out a virtual tabletop, so we never used that at all. Whereas from then, because we were all isolated, then that's when it sort of started and hasn't really left, I don't think.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, I've done quite a few. There was a game campaign. God, I can't believe I forgot it. It's been like the best one that I've played for a couple of years. It's a Delta Green game called Impossible Landscapes, and we did all of that on just on Zoom. Now I mentioned that for those who are privy to that game, very clue heavy. There's a lot of note taking. I think if you don't take notes, you're going to struggle to get through that game. It's really, really difficult to get your head around. It's like surreal horror and stuff. It's actually when I was thinking of running for yourselves, so I won't go into it. But it's quite a challenging game. It's all surreal. If people are not bought into it, it can be quite hard. But we done that without, we took our own notes, but we did that without using a VTT, and it was over Zoom. So, I think there's a lot of games for me. If I'm running a game, I tend to prefer not needing to faff about with VTTs, mostly because most games that I run with any of the groups that I run for, there's always someone that gets stuck. There's always a tech issue that involves needing to go in and configuring your devices or something. There's always something that comes up and eats away the first 30 minutes to an hour of the game, between that and chatting. It's just, I tend to prefer not needing to bother with all the faff. I'd rather have people present and focusing just on the game than faffing around with tools and trying to focus on that too. But it depends really what the game is. So for me, my main preference would be for something that's light, or something that's maybe not too map heavy. I'd almost 100% of the time I'd be going for like a theatre of the mind approach, and I'd be putting us into just a call rather than Roll20. There's games like that I have done with us, but I tend to just have a picture as a background image while we play the game.
Well,
that's it.
I mean, the games I can think about like that you've done, it has literally just been a single picture that's went up. It's not been, this is picture A for Zone A, this is picture B for Zone B.
Yeah, and here's all the baddies pictures and that. Yeah,
it's literally just been, that kind of fits the theme, and it stops you looking at a white checkered screen, having that burn into your eyeballs whilst you're talking to each other.
Yeah, and that's mostly, I mean, that's just because our group uses Roll20, but if we didn't, it would have been a Zoom call or a Facebook call. So that's kind of my preference, but I guess your preference probably would be using a VTT.
I mean, me personally, I would prefer using it because, again, like I've talked about in different episodes, I don't I don't class myself as being particularly creative, and as well as that, also don't class myself as having a particularly brilliant imagination, which then means when you combine that in terms of RPGs and stuff, I'm kind of way at the back of the queue. So having those little visual prompts or audio prompts or whatever it is, it helps. It helps somebody like me. So again, I prefer, like, if we're not in person, I prefer that if we were in person and it was, something physical, whether it's miniatures or whether it's a map or whether it's some form of prop to describe something or a picture or whatever it is, if there's something physically there that I can look at, that I can then use as a sort of a jump point to then get my imagination going, that's my preference. So I don't care if it's virtual, I don't care if it's physical, I just prefer having something there.
Yeah, and that's the thing. It's not to say, because this episode we're talking about running games without a VTT, but that doesn't mean that one's better than the other or anything like that. It can be depending on the group or depending on the players at the table. For some of the ones, there's a couple of guys I've played with online, not kind of regularly, but I've done quite a few games with them now, and they're overseas, so we tend just to use Zoom. And if there's anything pressing, they might share the screen and show a picture of something. Maybe it's a clue or maybe it's a character portrait they've prepared. That's actually in part, like, one of the guys I know currently that's one of the regular groups I'm in. He hates running games online, but that's because he's doing like PowerPoint presentations with all this transitions. He's doing a PowerPoint, sharing the screen, it's all this stuff. The effort's appreciated, but I'm also kind of like, well, if it's hard work, don't bother putting in all the work for that. Or even if he's using it for other games, cool. But just don't bother needing to do it over Discord, because it puts him off running some games. And it's a shame because he's good, but it's just the way it is. Whereas the group of the guys that are overseas, we've never used a VTT except for maybe one game, and the learning curve was way too much. But the thing is, for me, that's my preference, just for the prep sake, like, I've mentioned this before, I don't get a lot of time during the week unless I've got something that's cancelled during the week or something. I don't have a lot of time to prep, and the times I have prepped or have had time to prep and I've used a VTT, I end up spending most of that prepping the VTT instead of prepping the game. But that doesn't mean, though, for some of the games that we've done, I do like, because it's the least amount of work, but I think you get a bit more of the immersion, as if I've got the time, I'll prepare a VTT, well, like Roll20, and just for a kind of key moments, I'll just have usually I've got the kind of landing page for a group that might have a cool picture. I mean, an Nazi biker game, I had stuff with it, but if that, let's say there wasn't maps and stuff, it would have just been your group of bikers as the first one, maybe one of the monsters as the next one, and then probably some crazy guy as the third one, because that was a big moment in the game. So it's more just set pieces, just to set the scene, maybe set the vibe, and particularly just to give people a bit of a flavour about what's going on in the scene. So
and just when you're saying there about the prep for like the virtual tabletops, like just now I have a Cthulhu game sitting there, essentially ready to go. But the main reason that we haven't done it is because I've not got round to finishing loading the tabletop with everything that should happen. Partly because of time, partly because of, you're sitting going, do I really want to go and click and re-click and drag and, and sit and physically go through everything? Because I've started it now, so to then stop and bin it and then just the single picture would feel like total defeat. So there's a bit of that going on. There's all sorts of different things going on for me that means that I've started it, so I need to finish it, and that's essentially why we haven't done it. So another good argument for not using a virtual tabletop is you get stuff done, because at the end of the day, whether you're using props, whether you're not using props, whatever, the crux of what you do should be the story because that's the thing that people are going to engage with. That's the thing that people are going to expand upon. That's the thing that people are going to explore and have fun with, rather than, oh, it's a nice picture you've got. You know, it'll help, and it'll help sell whatever your story is, and that's the way you always need to remember. It's that stuff's only there to help you tell the story. So if you've not got it there, then you can focus on that and you don't get distracted.
Yeah, I mean, if I've got the time, usually my prep goes prepping the game, and if I've got time, I'll either set up a VTT or something like it. It's basically a slideshow that has like just some pictures for the scene. It might be a monster, but if it's a Cthulhu game, it tends to be a monster picture. But running games without the VTTs, then I think the kind of big things that I would probably, just because that tends to be my default now, just because of the way things are, the stuff I absolutely pretty much default to and don't bother, most of the time don't bother getting a VTT set up, would be like a puzzle game or an investigative game, something like Call of Cthulhu, or something kind of spooky themed. I've ran a few Cult Divinity Lost games over something like Zoom. These are games that they don't rely on. I think the big ones, if I was to give people tips for running games without VTTs but it was still online, it'd be games that don't rely on like distances and that. Like D&D's there's a big focus on distances and stuff just because it's the nature of the game. Now, I've ran that game many times in person and online without using VTTs to measure distances, without maps, and I just kind of make it a simpler thing where people are either kind of like Alien, you're either engaged or medium, you're either kind of engaged, you're in short range, medium or long, and I just kind of have people pick their stuff. They'll tell me the distance. If their spell's 120 feet for D&D, I'll say they can hit long range. Cool. If they're much further away, they can't hit them. It just keeps it easy and keeps it moving. I rarely actually use maps anymore in any of my games, but I think for running games that are online, for sure, without VTTs, investigative ones are big ones for it. Games that have simplified, or you can simplify the rules of combat so that they don't rely on distance, is a big one. Like Call of Cthulhu does have distances and stuff. It's also got like move is actually something we've never done a chase actually in Call of Cthulhu ever, but there's some cool little rules about how chase sequences work. However, you don't need to have a map down for it. You don't need a VTT for it. Morkborg has simplified movement kind of rules, so does Alien, very similar. You've kind of got a movement action, and then so it's up to a room's worth of movement in Morkborg. Alien's got a fast action which you can move up to a room's worth, and so kind of simple action, if you want to call it that, in your main action, which would be like hitting somebody with your sword. So all that sort of stuff. These simplified rules around combat are simpler systems. OSR ones are good for this. Any OSR games actually tends to be quite good and doesn't need to have a VTT. These are ones that can be a lot easier to run and help you really use your theatre of the mind, just to get the game going, getting into the flow, getting immersed in it. So certainly if people are wanting to try running a game, but maybe you're sitting there and you've got an idea for one, but you've never used a VTT, and the whole idea of needing to go in and set up an account and do all this. New. Just try something simple. Just keep it super simple. Do a puzzle game. Do something. I love spooky games. It's my bias, right? But if you do a game that is something more horror focused, you're less likely to need to worry about the combat, which is where things like the arenas and stuff will matter more, especially if you're doing D&D. But there's a whole wealth of games out there, like I mentioned, Morkborg or Alien could work, or any OSR game for that matter. Cult Divinity Lost, Call of Cthulhu. There's a few others, but I won't go into it. All these games are great places to start if you're familiar with them to begin with. But for running a game without a VTT, because let's be honest, sometimes you just want to sit down with your pals and have a chat, or just have a wee catch up while playing a game. And when you need to sit in a GM's chair and prepare all of that, especially if it's off the cuff, it's a pain in the ass. Like doing a VTT, any VTT, it's just more work. So that's my kind of recommendations for it, if that makes sense. But yeah, have you got any thoughts on that?
No, I mean pretty much what you're saying. at the end of the day, it can enhance what you're doing, but it's more preparation time that you've got. If it's something completely new to you, you need to remember and factor in that you need to learn how to work the tabletop, as well as getting all the stuff into the tabletop. Also, that if you've got something that is really precious to you, that you spent a lot of time working on, and that, you know, it's your opus magnum, you know, and you've got that ready to go. Remember that if you've also got new players that are unfamiliar with the tabletop, they'll spend as much time asking where things are and what to click and what is this, why is this, you know, whatever it is. So maybe start off with something that's
just keep it a bit simple.
More, yeah.
Just keep it simple, and if you do want to show stuff, you can always share it on screen if you're using Zoom. So you don't have to not have handouts. You know, you don't have to not have things that you can show your players. I mean, while I've said if I've got the time, the way I do my prep is I prep the game first, and then I might use a VTT to do like the slideshows. But just as equally, sometimes I've had games where I had the time to prep the game, but I wouldn't have been able to do Roll20, for example. For the most part, I can't use it because I've exceeded my memory limit on that, so I don't pay for a subscription or anything. So, however, the online games I've done, I'll just share screen, just put it up on screen, or just, you know, share the actual file on the screen. And so there's plenty of ways to actually still get all that information and still have visuals and even have music in some of the kind of video messaging platforms as well. So yeah, it's just about keeping it simple, and it doesn't mean it's better. I prefer it just because it's just less work to do it. Specifically, people, I play with different people of different skill levels when it comes to tech, and there's a lot of them that haven't used any virtual tabletop, and I don't want to need to have them getting frustrated because they lose connections and stuff. So that's why my default tends to be without a VTT. I think the only thing that I would then say, then just to tie it all off, is just if you're going to opt for not using a virtual tabletop, be prepared to have people getting confused about certain things. If you don't have any visual cues and stuff, because quite often I don't. Even nowadays, I don't tend to have maps, even in person, although I might sketch a map out on the screen. I might sketch a map out on the paper, and I have done it on the screen with like whiteboards on Zoom and stuff. Just to give people a general idea of the environment, especially if it's more like a dungeon crawl. But if you're not using anything like that, which I would say is the biggest downside of just playing online with no virtual tabletop, is it can be a bit confusing for people, especially if you're working in your storytelling or something, or even if you're good, it's dead easy for details to get missed by players. So be prepared for that, and if you're playing it, be prepared to expect for things not to land. Don't be worried about clarifying something with your GM, and if you're a GM, be prepared to clarify, because it does happen a lot, especially if you're doing a combat game. Recently I did a D&D game that there was no visuals, cues, it was just over Teams, Zoom. And yeah, people got confused during the combat because that's the most engaging, like most involved part of D&D. But that was fine. Who cares? It's fine if they get mixed up with who they were hitting, or what guy or fan misunderstood what their target was and stuff. I just shifted damage over and things. It's just worth being flexible. So just be prepared. That's all.
And again, like, it's a decent piece of advice to carry through if you're playing in person as well. If someone gets confused, then, you know, don't worry about it, don't panic, and just make a decision. So again, like Jordan's saying, whether it's alright, you wanted to hit this person rather than this person, that's fine, flip the damage, or whether it's alright, you wanted to do that rather than this, sorry, my fault, next time I know what you're meaning, and we'll pick it up from that point. You know, at the end of the day, not that big a deal, as long as you're consistent and as long as the momentum carries forward as best as possible.
Yeah, certainly one last bit of advice I would give is if you're doing it online, and this applies if you're using a virtual tabletop as well, and you're running a game, keep scrap paper there. Use that to track all your initiative, all your damage, who hit who for how much, etc. because I'll tell you something. See, it does happen where people wanted to hit, you know, the leader of the bad guy group, the leader of the bandit camp, you know, and then you've thought they wanted to hit the lieutenant or something. It happens all the time. So just keep that in order, because big benefit of virtual tabletops. To be fair, if you've got a time, just use a VTT, you know, but especially games that are combat heavy like D&D, initiative is obviously very important, and it's very easy to miss people if you've not got a record of it. So definitely get some scrap paper that you can write stuff and chuck it away after, just to keep it as smooth as possible for you running the game. I don't think any of the games I've done without Roll20 or any of these other tools, none of them just went bad. They've all went pretty smooth, but like I've said before, it's all kind of horror-based games I use, so combat tends to be easier in them because they don't last as long. So either
everybody dies anyway.
Yeah, either they kill the baddie quick, so they'll team up on them, or the baddie kills them all pretty quick. So it's usually over in a few turns. If it was D&D, yeah, it's a lot more complicated. I would actually almost recommend using a VTT if you're going to do D&D, but it's possible to do without it. I've done it, so it's not too bad. But yeah, so I think that's going to be everything for this episode. I think what we will do at some point, I don't know when, but you mentioned hybrid games earlier. Might be worth doing a wee talk about that at some point. And one I would like to cover is actually using the VTTs and how you can prepare your games and stuff in advance to give people the best game that you can over an online platform. But we'll cover that in other episodes, I think. So yeah, I think we'll just throw it over to you for the socials.
Yep, so like we said earlier on, we have Discord out there, so you can get in touch with us there if you want to answer any questions that we've given you, or if you want to complain about anything that we've done, anything that we haven't done, that kind of thing, or suggestions, sometimes people call them. There's Facebook as well, there's X, which I need to remember not called Twitter for political reasons, Instagram, which, you know, if you're being a bit different, you could get in touch with us there, I suppose. And yeah, so YouTube comments underneath there, and Spotify, there's usually a wee poll or a question that we'll fire out there and things as well. So you can get in touch with us in those different places, and you can listen and or watch us on Spotify and YouTube, and you can listen to us on other podcasty platforms where, like Apple Podcast, that's got quite a few people there. So
yeah, so that's basically everything for this episode. So we just want to say thanks again for listening and or watching, and it's bye from me
and me as well.